A single income could buy a house, 2 cars, and a summer vacation. No debt spiral, no side hustles, no spreadsheets tracking every dollar. If someone grew up middle class in the 1980s, they remember a version of that life that barely exists anymore. And the strange part is, nobody thought it was special at the time. It was just normal. This was a decade when being middle class actually meant something. It meant stability. It meant a 3-bedroom house in the suburbs, a station wagon in the driveway, and enough left over to take the family to Disney World. Dad worked 1 job. Mom might work 2, but she did not have to. The mortgage was manageable. The credit cards were paid off each month. There was no anxiety about grocery bills or whether the kids could go to college. The American middle class in the 1980s was not rich, but it was comfortable in a way that feels almost impossible to describe to someone trying to make it today. Let's walk through what that life actually looked like and why it felt so completely different from what middle class means now. Some of this might bring back memories. Some of it might explain why people talk about the 1980s like a lost golden age. Let's step into that world. The house was the center of everything. A middle-class family in the 1980s could buy a home on a household income of around $30,000 a year. The average home price was roughly $75,000. That math worked. Monthly payments were something a family could handle without panic. These houses were not mansions. They were split levels, ranches, and colonials in subdivisions with names like Oak Ridge and Meadow Brook. The yards were big enough for kids to play in. The garage held 2 cars and a collection of tools and sports equipment. Neighbors knew each other. People borrowed lawn mowers and returned them. Block parties happened in the summer. Kids ran between houses until the street lights came on, and that was the signal to come home for dinner. Inside, the house had wall-to-wall carpeting in neutral tones, a kitchen with laminate countertops, and a family room with a big television console. The television was the centerpiece. Cable was becoming standard, which meant MTV, HBO, and dozens of channels that made families feel like they had the world at their fingertips. The VCR sat underneath, blinking 12 o'clock because nobody could figure out how to set the time. Friday nights meant renting a movie from the video store. The whole family would go wandering the aisles, debating between comedies and action movies, and picking up microwave popcorn on the way home. The economics of middle-class life in the 1980s were fundamentally different. A factory worker, a teacher, a postal carrier, or a mid-level office manager could afford a life that now requires 2 six-figure incomes. Health insurance came through the employer, and it covered almost everything. Copays were $5 or $10. Nobody talked about deductibles the way people do now. Pensions were still common. People expected to retire at 62 or 65 with a guaranteed income for life. The concept of saving $1 million in a retirement account would have seemed absurd. The company took care of that. College tuition at a state university was a few $1,000s a year. A summer job could pay for a significant portion of it. Student debt existed, but it was not the crushing burden it became in later decades. Parents saved a little, kids worked part-time, and somehow it all worked out. Before we continue with the culture and lifestyle that made this decade so distinctive, if you are enjoying this look back at how Americans really lived and want to explore more decades and places, consider subscribing. There are so many more stories about how life in America has changed in ways people rarely talk about. The mall was the middle-class cathedral. Families spent weekends there. Mothers shopped at JCPenney and Sears. Fathers browsed the electronics section at Radio Shack. Kids vanished into the arcade, feeding quarters into Pac-Man and Galaga. The food court was where everyone met back up with Orange Julius, Sparrow Pizza, and a soft pretzel from Auntie Anne's. The mall was not just shopping, it was socializing, entertainment, and a place to be seen. Teenagers spent entire Saturdays there, walking in groups, trying on clothes they could not afford, and hanging around hoping to run into someone from school. Middle-class families did not feel like they were struggling to keep up. The neighbors had roughly the same things: similar cars, similar houses, similar vacations. There was no social media showing what everyone else had. Keeping up with the Joneses was limited to the actual Joneses next door, and they were living the same life. The cars in the driveway were Buicks, Chevrolets, Fords, and maybe a Chrysler minivan as the decade went on. These were not luxury vehicles, they were reliable and affordable. A new car cost around $10,000. Families could pay it off in 3 or 4 years without strain. Vacations were simple, but they felt like everything. The family road trip was still the standard, piling into the car and driving to the beach, the mountains, or a national park, staying at a Holiday Inn or a Best Western, eating at Denny's or Howard Johnson's. These trips were not extravagant, but they happened every summer because a middle-class family could afford them without going into debt. Disney World was the dream vacation. Families saved up for it, and when they went, it felt monumental. Ticket prices were affordable enough that a week in Orlando was within reach for a family earning a modest income. The food on a middle-class table told its own story. Dinners were simple and predictable. Meatloaf on Monday, spaghetti on Wednesday, fish sticks on Friday. Casseroles made with Campbell's cream of mushroom soup were a staple. Hamburger Helper stretched a pound of ground beef into a meal for 5. Grocery bills were manageable. A family could fill a cart for $40 or $50. Brand loyalty was strong. Families bought the same cereal, the same bread, the same peanut butter week after week. Eating out was a treat, not a routine. Going to a sit-down restaurant like Red Lobster or Applebee's was a special occasion. Fast food was for busy nights. McDonald's, Burger King, and Wendy's were where kids begged to go, and parents gave in because a meal for the family cost under $15. What made middle-class life in the 1980s feel so different was not just the economics, though the economics mattered enormously. It was the sense of security. People believed they were on solid ground. The job would be there next year. The pension was building. The house was gaining value. The kids would do at least as well as their parents, probably better. That belief, that confidence in forward progress shaped everything about how middle-class families lived. They were not anxious, they were not calculating, they were just living. Kids in middle-class families had a particular kind of childhood. They rode bikes without helmets. They played unsupervised in the neighborhood for hours. They drank water from the garden hose. Saturday mornings were for cartoons. After school was for playing outside until dinner. Homework existed, but it did not dominate evenings the way it does now. There were no tutors, no enrichment programs, no pressure to build a college resume at age 12. Kids were just kids. Parents did not hover. The expectation was simple. Go outside, come home when the streetlights turn on, do not break anything. Entertainment was communal. Families watched television together because there was one set in the house. Everyone saw the same shows. The Cosby Show, Family Ties, Cheers, and Growing Pains were shared cultural experiences. When something happened on a show, the whole country talked about it the next day. Music was everywhere. The radio played in the kitchen during breakfast. MTV played in the family room after school. Records and cassette tapes were bought at the mall. Going to a concert was affordable. Tickets to see major acts cost $15 or $20. The 1980s middle class was not without problems. The decade brought recessions, factory closures, and the beginning of economic shifts that would hollow out the middle class in the decades ahead. Manufacturing jobs began moving overseas. unions lost power. The gap between the wealthy and everyone else started widening, though most middle-class families did not feel it yet. The warning signs were there, but the lived experience still felt stable and secure. What defined the middle class in the 1980s was that it was genuinely middle. Not struggling, not wealthy, just comfortably in between. One income could sustain a family. Two incomes meant extras, not necessities. The house was affordable. The health care was covered. The retirement was planned. The kids could go to college without drowning in debt. The vacation happened every year. For those who lived it, middle-class life in the 1980s was not glamorous. It was meatloaf dinners and wood-paneled station wagons and renting movies on Friday night. But it was stable. It was secure. It was a life where people could breathe without worrying whether one bad month would send everything crashing down. That is what made it feel so different. Not that it was luxurious, but that it was enough. And enough, as it turns out, was everything. For those with memories of this remarkable era, there is always more history to explore.